Just today in my hotel room before coming here, I was looking at some of the news channels, and apparently Al Jazeera shows also in Copenhagen. So I was watching Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera's primary source of information about what's happening in Syria is through mobile phone technology. They are using images of protests that are being shot by Syrians on the ground through their mobile phones and uploaded outside of Syria. So it is playing a critical role. One could argue that the Syrian regime probably is much more aware now of the potential of Facebook groups and Twitter, and is doing as much as it can to find out who's active on Facebook and to make sure that they can track them down and shut that down if possible. But Syria, I mean, it's very interesting situation, because the Arab League actually took a very strong stand against it. And Syria is essentially, I would say, one of the countries that is in the crossfire of this Cold War, because tell you very, very transparently that it is essentially a choice for the Syrian government that the Arab League proposes, that you need to choose who you're going to stand with. Are you going to continue your relationship with the Iranian government, or are you going to start taking a more moderate path and a more path that is more cohesive and in line with the current Arab states? Al Jazeera has an interesting history. As I mentioned, it's owned by the government of Qatar, so it's very much in line with the foreign policies of the Qatari government. I think that the revolutions that we saw were very much popular revolutions. Initially, when, for example, the protests happened in Tahrir Square, Saudi Arabia was very unhappy with what it was seeing happen to a longtime ally and regime of Hosni Mubarak. In fact, many Western countries were very concerned, because Hosni Mubarak was a longtime regime of the West. But I think once government saw that the tide was turning against the regime of Mubarak, they stood by, some silently, but accepted that his time was ended. And for Al Jazeera to take sides is not a new thing, quite frankly, Martin. Al Jazeera's coverage is always, as I mentioned, very much driven by the political agenda of the government that funds it and then that owns it. And so I think from a population or the Arab streets standpoint, it welcomed that Al Jazeera was covering the events in Egypt and Tunisia in a very pro-protest, pro-revolution manner. But the governments of the region clearly and understandably were concerned that, as you mentioned yourself, well, if Mubarak falls, what's going to take his place? I think the point I'm trying to make is that Saudi Arabia and Egypt may have some things in common, but that doesn't mean that both are going to have revolutions. And at the end of the day, it should be also what is the will of the people. The will of the people in Egypt was clearly that we are fed up of Hosni Mubarak. He's been running our country into the ground. The percent of growth in the country is on the rise in Egypt before his collapse, but the distribution of wealth was appalling. Most Egyptians were living in increasing poverty. So the Egyptian people spoke, and they did what they needed to do for their country. And I think that there's no one formula for the entire region. Every country needs, this is why I emphasize civil society. Civil society, the people need to decide what is best for their country at this point in the history of their country.